Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and in today's episode of Dyepot Weekly, sponsored by Nicole Jimenez, we are going to dye 5 different types of yarn with some dry dye powder, acid dye powder. I have not gone into my Jacquard acid dye jars since I made my stock solutions about 9 months ago. So I have only used them once, and I was really nervous at the time. Since then, I have played with a lot more dry dye powders, from Dylan hand dyes to Tulip tie-dye powders, and I really love applying hand painting yarn with dry powder. So today we are going to pre-soak all of this yarn in a water and vinegar solution, lay them out, and then sort of layer the dry powder on top of it and see how much or how little the colors spread, and hopefully we'll get something that is really beautiful. Nicole, thank you so much for sponsoring this video. I do not know yet which skein of yarn will be yours, but I promise that I will send you my favorite. I will talk about the 5 skeins of yarn in a moment, but first I wanted to pre-soak all of the yarn in some water with vinegar. Both of these containers have 16 cups of water with 4 tablespoons of white vinegar, and I'm going to let the yarn pre-soak for at least 30 minutes. You never want to risk inhaling any dye powders, so for safety I will be wearing safety glasses and using this dust mask. Today we are going to look at up to 5 colors of Jacquard acid dye: sky blue, jet black, silver gray, pink, and violet. I think the jet black might skew a little brown, and it's possible that by applying the dry powder, the gray will look fairly black, but we aren't really going to know until we start trying to apply these powders to the yarn. Given the small vials, I'm not sure about my ability to pinch out the dye, so I might have to transfer some of the powder into a cup so that way I can easily handle it. But let's just see how this will go. The 5 skeins of yarn that we are using today are Knit Pick Stroll, Swish DK, Hawthorne, Wool of the Andes, and Simply Wool in the colorway Winkle. The Stroll is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. The Swish is 100% superwash merino. Hawthorne is 80% superwash wool, 20% polyamide. Wool of the Andes is 100% Peruvian Highland wool. And then Simply Wool is 100% wool. These last 2 are non-superwash, so I expect that even with the vinegar pre-soak, that the colors will strike a little slower than they might to these 3 superwash varieties. I had intended to only pre-soak it for 30 minutes, but it ended up being over 24 hours before I could start this process. My goal today is not speckles. My goal today is to achieve the kind of look that I see when I use the dry tulip tie-dye powder. The one thing is that I know that these acid dyes are going to strike to the fiber faster than the tie-dye powder does, which spreads out a lot more. So I don't think it'll be quite the same. We might get some speckling, but the better way to get speckling, and okay, I cannot reach my fingers into the container, so I will be tapping out some color into this cup. If I wanted to get speckles, I should do this under hot water. And if I had these in hot water, that would let the dyes strike the fastest. So right now I am just sprinkling, and I will probably up the patchiness of this in a moment, the color onto all of the yarn. One of the reasons why I decided to look at the Simply Wool in addition to these other colors is that I wanted to see, I think that this wool has a little more lanolin in it, so it's a little oilier. But I also wanted to see, you know, how well these colors show up on a gray base. So right now my questions are, how far is this powder going to go? How deep will the colors penetrate? Yeah, I guess those are my main questions, because I think there's no doubt that all right, this powder didn't quite go as far as I thought it might, but we're getting a nice blue color. I definitely think that some of this could spread out more. Some of these might spread out more. Right now I'm seeing some little specks like I might see with Kool-Aid, but I'm curious if that will remain, because with the tie-dye powder, it does not. There's like a little bit of powder right here that I like want to bring up, but I can dot that up. I am very curious. Okay, this is the hand that was touching the dye. I do see, it looks like that this might be fairly shallow. I wasn't applying it very hard though, so I'm curious. I mean, it's definitely going through a couple of layers, but when I'm looking at some of these tiny specks, they are the like most, and I guess I'm gonna get this little bit off my fingers just onto here. The places where the dye went on really finely is really striking to that spot. Now it could spread out more over time, so I'm curious what this will look like in a little while, but for now it's feeling reminiscent of Kool-Aid. But this is what the tie-dye powder looked like at the beginning as well. Okay, here's some jet black. And I'm going to go ahead and use the same cup that I had used before. Maybe pull out a bit more of the powder. So these were 1/2 ounce containers, and I have taken out 10 grams of dye from each of them, but otherwise I have not gone into these pots yet, or at least back in. This is my first time, I think, touching this dye with my fingers. So this is all very much a learning process for me. But yeah, I feel like the dye is finer than the tie-dye powder, which is one big reason why I'm wearing the mask in the first place. And you can definitely, ooh, there's some really nice, with this black, some really nice speckles right now. I could see how if I was doing this in hot, where that was striking right away, that would give a stunning, stunning effect. I mean, it might give us a stunning effect here right now as well. As I tap the rest out. But you can see my glove is getting very pigmented now. But before we steam, I'm taking a look. Okay, some of these little blue specks are definitely starting to spread more. The dye is absorbing, and the colors are spreading a bit, and potentially spreading through a bit as well. I have a feeling I will be going through a lot of gloves today, because I just don't want to contaminate the dyes. Okay, I wanted to zoom in a bit and show you. I had just added these blacks, and you know, through here we're seeing like really, really sharp specks, and then up here, you know, there's some really, really fine dots. I mean, I think what's really fun for me about this is that this is so sharp. And that's now, but up until now, for making speckles, I've used sprinkles a lot, I've used Kool-Aid a lot, but I haven't tried it with just acid dye. And there is no question that this is far superior. And I'm really liking this hand method and actually even like the cup method. I think that this, oh, I'm not showing the place where I'm pointing to. I really like this distribution, which actually on camera looks a bit bigger, but I am pleased with how this is going so far. The concern I have right now is how balanced will this yarn feel? Will the colors spread? They spread a fair amount with the tulip tie-dye powder or not. But I know in the end we're going to end up with a beautiful, beautiful yarn for Nicole. Next, let's take a look at this silver gray. Whoa. The powder, what's funny is that there seems to be a bit more powder. Or maybe it just pours easily, but the powder for the silver gray is quite pale. I'm really curious how this is going to compare to the black. And what's funny is like as I'm dusting it on, you can barely see it. But then as it starts to get wet, it's definitely a gray. But it also is reading pretty similarly to the black. Putting some in this like lower section so that way we can clearly see where it comes up. Yeah, so I think that, you know, I'm adding it fairly heavily, but I have a feeling there's something in here that is not dye. Because even as I add this like a lot heavily in sections, the color that is coming up, and you can see it on the gray background, the color that's coming up feels way, way less potent than the black. It does look like the specks themselves are very similar in intensity to the black. It's just a lot less potent, if that makes sense. All right, let's try. I'm adding this into the same container that the gray was in. But here's some of the violet. It makes sense that they would have to cut the silver gray with something so that way you could still make like a similar stock solution. But yeah, look at the difference just in how dark this violet powder is. I'm pretty sure that that was the violet. It's looking very, what's funny is this one is very, it's a little clumpier, it's very opaque. It actually feels very, very dry, but look how much it's getting like on my fingers. What's funny is that I'm not feeling the purple yet, and I think it still needs to sort of get wet. And maybe it's because I'm wearing my safety goggles that's making it a little harder to see. I am observing something I've observed before with the blue. I'm seeing a few red splotches. And I don't know if there's like just a tiny amount of red in the blue. Sorry, that's a purpley patch. I'm gonna make sure to add some color on these edges. We will be flipping this and adding more dye to the other side after we let this first side sit a bit, but that, all right, it's definitely starting to look more like the violet now. The violet tends to read as a bit blue versus purple. And that is one of the reasons why I wanted to add some pink to this combination. Now I have found that the pink is actually very similar to the fire red in that I think that the tone of this pink is very, very close to the tone in the fire red. I think that the fire red diluted, to me, looks a lot like this pink, is what I'm meaning. But, whoo, that is pink. Bringing some nice warmth into all this. Ooh, I'm really enjoying the way this gray is going. The pink on the gray is just gorgeous. I mean, the pink is gorgeous on all of them, but I tend to be like a big fan of cool tones, but I'm really liking what this is adding to our yarn. Got a little down here. Yeah, in some cases, if you don't have a lot of dye in the cup, I am finding it a bit easier to sort of tap it. Whoops. I sort of want more on the end, and I just touched it, which is not quite what I wanted to do. But, oh, that is spreading out. Oh, this is pretty. I'm pretty surprised how purple the purples feel, but so far there might be a little more I can get out of this one. So far I think that this is really, really lovely, and it is feeling a little similar, but the colors so far are a bit sharper. I am seeing that the blues have started to spread out a bit. Same with the grays, probably because there's no heat. But I'm going to go ahead and let this sit for 5 minutes, and then we can flip it and start seeing like how far it penetrated and start adding some colors to the other side. This is while we are waiting, and you can see here some of the gray specks, and that they are more oval versus the sharp circles. There's still some sharpness in the violet, which we did a little later. The blues are spreading out pretty nicely. I'm still unsure how deep the color penetration is going to be, since I've been adding it on really shallow. But I just wanted to give a close-up of some of these regions. Okay, let's flip these over. The blues have definitely spread. A lot of the other things are, but I'm curious. This isn't penetrating super far, but let's just flip. Yeah, we're having a fairly blank canvas over here. So I think unlike the tulip dyes, where, although here, did I flip that right? Unlike the tulip dyes where things go through pretty well, that might not be the case here. But as I am touching it and moving it, that might lead to, oh yeah, see if I touch it, now some of the colors actually might be spreading a bit. Or, oh, you know what it is? It's probably because I have dye on my hand. Oh. I was all like, ooh, it's like soaking through. Not, oh, I now have dye on my hands. So as I touch it, I am spreading some of that color. Yeah, but it will be touching itself. I'm not planning to wrap it up in plastic wrap as I prepare to go again. The nice thing is that the dye is really going where I want it to. It's not, during that break, I wiped the floor and it didn't go on the floor. So that is very good. I want to make sure there is some dye left in the jars because I don't know if I'm going to need to do this a third time. Or if the 2 times will be pretty sufficient. But I should probably try to be aiming for some heavier like coverage in spots, but I'm sort of digging the the way that this is going. And the nice thing is that I've picked all of the colors that I've picked are ones that will layer on top of each other really beautifully. So we're not going to get mud here, which is nice. Unfortunately, it is a bit humid today. But yeah, I think this is really cool. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsor, Nicole, for supporting the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and sponsoring this video. If you'd like to learn more about how to sponsor a Dyepot Weekly episode, check out the link in the video description and the iCard to the ChemKnits Creations Etsy store for more details. But Nicole selected a surprise when it came to the yarn base she wanted for this episode. And so I decided to go for like all of my favorite yarn bases, and then I'm going to pick the colorway that's my favorite in the very end. So Nicole, right now I don't know which one is yours, but I think that is part of part of the fun of this process. I might end up wanting more black. I am not sure. There is some around the edges that in the end I might like kind of go dab, dab, dab to pick some up. Here's some more of this gray, which, yeah, this yellow stuff in the gray is absolutely filler. If you look closely at the gray, you can see like some particles in it. And I think that those particles are the dye and the rest of it is just filler. But the thing about it that's still cool is that we can get some really nice lighter coverage of a color from this gray dye. And I think that is cool. It's probably also similar to a reason why, I mean, it could be easier to get some speckles with the silver gray than black, maybe. One speckling technique is to use, is to cut the color with something. So for example, you could add salt or citric acid to your mixtures, and that was a lot of gray right there. And adding it to the mixtures can help you sort of get a more spread out coverage, so you don't end up with like clusters. But I really like these clusters of the black. I am gonna need to play around a lot more with this. Definitely need to. Yeah, I think that the difference in texture from the different dyes is really interesting to me. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm now like I'm not worrying as much about like reusing the same container with the different colors. So that is pretty nice. And the other thing I should point out is that I am using all of these colors. I'm dyeing all of these yarns at the same time. They might be different bases, but they're definitely not one like dye lot. Because, I'm not measuring the amount that's going on each one. It is fairly random. So one might have a lot more purple, one might have a lot more pink, etc., etc. but nevertheless, I think that this is just awesome. Playing with dye powders is definitely more dangerous. I think there's more risks of like inhaling the powders and whatnot, but it is absolutely something I personally really enjoy. I love the way that we can just layer these colors on top of one another. And these pops of pink amongst these cooler tones is just really fun. So I do wish, like, the tulip tie-dye powder has a little more grit to it. So it's easier to pick up, a little easier to put on, but this is fun. I am looking forward to doing this in a more low immersion kind of setup in the future, but for now, this is really fun. And the way these colors are showing up on this gray, I just ordered a 10-pack of this gray base, so I'm excited to play around with it a lot. I think one way, if you wanted to make sure you got you could play with the balance of the colors a bit, you could measure the colors before like putting them in the cup. But my goal today is to try to, and sort of like on these end patches, my goal is to try to get color on all the yarn. And I don't mind bare patches at all. In fact, I really like the bare patches, but I want to see if these colors spread, and if they spread, how much they spread. And so that is one of my major questions today. All right, we have added our dye onto all of the yarn. And I don't know, I'm really excited with how it's looking. And you know, there's some places where we see right now these really sharp specks, but that's still with the purple that's still sort of soaking in, and some of the gray. And these colors have absolutely not started to set yet. We need heat still, but I like that this has sort of like a dark broken violet feel because of the blue, the purple, and the pink. I'm going to go ahead and let this sit for 20 minutes. And I'm just going to let it sit and let the colors sort of spread, if they will, or not. And then we'll come back and get ready to steam them so we can set the color. Now, my plan, like, I could move this around again and add more color a third time. But I don't want to do that because I want to see how good of the color penetration we got just by doing this twice. But you could absolutely shift it around and do it some more. 20 minutes later, and the colors have spread out a lot more on the non-superwash yarn than they have on the superwash counterpots, where we can still see some sharp speckles. There are some speckles on the non-superwash yarn as well. They are just, there's fewer of them and they're a little less sharp, consistent with what we see with these fiber types. Now it is time to put the yarn into my steamer basket, but first I'm sort of moving it a bit. I'm curious, I'm not seeing huge white patches, which is good, We want there to be reasonable color penetration throughout our yarn. So I'm just going to pick them up. There's some white patches. We'll get some color mixing through this step, but I'm trying to just carefully put them, whoops, inside the basket. I saw some yellow on that one. In a way so that they all have access to, oh dear, towards the bottom and the top. All right, I'm gonna have to set this down now. All right, we have all the colors. I'm gonna wipe off the rim and then go put this onto the steamer basket. The water level in the steamer basket is low enough that it will not touch the bottom of this pasta insert. And I'm now going to cover it, and I'm going to keep an eye on like the heat and stuff, but I am going to let this steam for 30 minutes. All right, the time is up, and we're still plenty of steamy. A quick look into the pot. I have a feeling there will be a fair amount of rinsing to do. I almost look like I see little hints of powder on top of some of the yarn. But we absolutely still have some speckles on one of our superwash friends. So I am actually going to quickly, because it's a little warm, lift up and remove that steamer basket from the pot. And ooh, look what we see. There is some color in there. I am curious, because there's some color, whether it's from like the bottom of the pot, some condensation dripping down. We don't know what the bottom of this pot is gonna look like. Oh, I guess you can't see it. We don't know what the bottom of this pot's gonna look like, and if the bottom just got super, super wet. I am going to let this one cool a bit before I attempt to remove the yarn so it can cool more. Let's take this yarn out and see what we see. It looks like that bottom is a little more saturated. Oh yeah, that bottom is a bit more wet, but I still see some white peeking out down there. I'm sort of like shifting them aside. Ooh, these colors are pretty. And okay, that runoff that I just saw looks clear. I do know that the pan itself did settle into some of the color. So it's unclear if, and when I pick them up, they're leaving clear behind. It's unclear to me if, whoa, I see some yellow. Huh. Looks like some of that gray left some yellow tones maybe. That runoff was looking clear, so maybe that leftover purple came from what was on the bottom or something, but either way, I am going to set this aside to let all of this cool. There's a little test that I'd like to do right now. I have a clean white paper towel, and I am just gonna pat this yarn, and all right, we definitely still have some color in here that is not bound. Whether this is some residual powder or what or not, I don't know. But it's helpful to know that it is there as we go into washing this. Let's start the washing with our two 100% wool skeins. And I do not always don gloves for the washing step, but I am today because I knew that there was going to be some dye that had not yet dissolved. And so we were going to need to rinse something out. It does pain me to pour that out, by the way. But I'm curious how long it'll take to rinse out this leftover color. And so right now the two skeins that I have are the two non-superwash yarns. And things look really dark because one of these is a gray backdrop. Already that's a lot paler. Normally I go from like room temperature to a little bit lukewarm water. And I'm trying to stay on that warm side today. because some dye does need a little more heat to dissolve. And I'm trying to remove the stubborn guys that are left behind. And I have not kept a good handle on this, so therefore I am going to start holding it like this. I think there's only one tie on the gray yarn, which I should have added another tie. I don't think I paid a close enough attention to it. I'm also going to start adding some soap. If your yarn does start to get tangled, I find it easier to untangle when it's dry. The water is still fairly cool. I'm going to up the heat a little bit. I do want to take care because these yarns can soak. But I get questions sometimes about that, and it really does take a fair amount of agitation for the felting to start to happen. But, all right, already the bleeding is getting less and less. So I'm trying to remove some of those studs. So I'm going to be patient because I'm going to remove these gloves right now. I'm going to be patient because I do not want there to be like unbound dye particles on this yarn. Not at all. But actually, oh, we're clear. I'm still, for good measure, going to give this a couple more rinses. But the water is looking really clear to me, actually. So that was not bad. And absolutely most of this color is in the yarn. Let's wash our superwash, friends. It might not be perfect, but let's grab the hawthorn. There we go. All right. It's worth taking the time to keep a good hand on them before you plop them in. And oh, that isn't bad at all. It did look like there was some like dye powder beaded up on top of the wool yarn. But on our superwash friends, I'm seeing a lot more speckles. I'm seeing spread out tones, but this is beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I'm curious if these yellow tones came from the black or from the gray, because the gray definitely looked yellow when I added it on, but it seemed like some of that had disappeared, but I do not know. Oh, that's looking like it's just the barest hint of color. I'm going to give it a few more rinses than I would if the water had started off clear. And now I'm adding the dish soap and removing gloves. I'm going to give it a couple more rinses because I just want to be sure that we've rinsed out all of the extra color to the best of our ability. But that is looking good. And this is looking gorgeous. When looking at all of the dry yarn, it is actually pretty easy to tell the difference between the superwash skeins and the non-superwash yarns. All of the yarn definitely has some speckles to it, but the speckles on the 3 different superwash skeins are much sharper. The colors did not spread out nearly as much as they did on our Wool of the Andes, 100% Peruvian Highland wool, and the Simply Wool, 100% wool yarns. The 3 remaining skeins are the 100% Superwash Merino. This is the Swish DK. We've got our Stroll Fingering, which is 75% Superwash Merino, 25% nylon. And then finally Hawthorn, which is 80% Superwash Fine Highland wool, 20% polyamide. The hues in this yarn are fairly consistent with the colors that we picked. The pink, the blue, the violet, gray, and jet black. However, there are also a few other hues that we see in here. And it's most notably around the black, or maybe it's the gray. There's definitely some of a peachy yellow, peachy brown color in here. I'm not sure if that is from the gray, which definitely had that orange powder around it, or if that's something that's around breaking with the black. It's a little hard to tell because in the powder form, the gray and black are very, very similar to one another. Likely because the silver gray, the pigments could be the same as what's in the black, just in it might be cut with whatever the that brownish color is in there. And so this is something that's just important to note, because as we are learning about these different colors and how maybe they break or don't break, then maybe that will help you make a decision when you're choosing to use these for speckling purposes later on. I don't think that this the addition of this hue detracts from the colorways as a whole. In fact, I think that it is a really nice complementary hue to these cool tones, but it's just something to keep in mind. The other thing to note is that I dyed all 5 of these skeins using the same technique at the same time, but the colorways are not identical. And the colorways also aren't repeating. There's some areas where, all right, maybe it's like pink that would show up on every round, but in other areas, you know, we've got more dark colors versus white in other spots. So what we have here are beautiful colors, but I would definitely call this a non-repeating colorway. I wanted to zoom in a bit so you could get a sense of our 2 non-superwash yarns, which all things considered are reasonably similar, even though the one now on top started off with the gray base and the one on bottom didn't. They actually complement one another really nicely, but don't even necessarily feel too different. The 3 superwash yarns also feel very similar. I have been sitting here off camera doing a little back and forth trying to decide which one of these is my favorite. Which one do I want to send to Nicole, our sponsor? And I think in the end, my favorite of all of these is the stroll. Something about the way that the coverage happened and the way that the colors and the speckles flow together really make this one in particular stand out to me. That's not to say that the other ones aren't also completely stunning. As I said, this was a really, really tough decision, but I think that this one just really pops and stands out from the bunch to me when I look at all of them. I would like to give another huge shout out to our sponsor of tonight's video, Nicole Jimenez. Thank you so much for sponsoring this episode of Dyepot Weekly. If you are interested in sponsoring an episode yourself and receiving 1 skein of yarn that I dye in the video, head over to the ChemKnits Creations Etsy store and check out the Dyepot Weekly sponsorship listing. You can find more details there, and I'll include the link both in the video description and the iCard. There was a reasonable amount of leftover dye, both on the counter and a little bit of extra powder in our cups. So make sure you stay tuned for a bonus episode where I used all the leftover dye to create these 2 different yet beautiful skeins of yarn. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and give the video a like. Thank you so much for watching.